My name is Peter Carantinos, and we are launching a Pacific-based channel to address the ginormous misinformation at the hands of mainstream media. And we're doing it as a part of the alternative media network that digital platforms throughout the world have been at work over the last 10 years reporting a counter narrative to the ones written and basically followed to the letter of the US State Department. I'm based in Sydney, Australia, and nowhere is it more poignant at the moment in the lead up to the ultimate addressing of the China-American conflict than a worm's eye view from within the Pacific itself. Let me state at the outset that what has led us to this point have been very critical crises that have reshaped the lay of the land completely within geopolitical and economic terms. The chief and most recent one of which has been the war in Ukraine, but really followed up very, very much on the heels of the October the 7th Hamas jailbreak, and arguably the most successful military operation in world history. Both those conflicts have heralded what I consider to be a millennial change. It is not simply a matter of the fall of the United States hegemony, nor is it an attempted resolution of the genocidal activities of Israel, and whether the tail wags the dog or the other way around in terms of the Israeli lobby on America. And neither is it a matter of a tweaking of economic interests in a tariff war. From my perspective, and the one that I will be putting forward in this series, is a millennial view. What we're actually seeing is the bookends of that start basically with the first Crusades in the 11th century and finishes basically with our time now. We're actually seeing the unraveling of the domination of the West globally. To that end, I will be drawing on my favourite feeds, people like Michael Hudson, John Mearsheimer, Scott Ritter, and a host of other channels which I think have been indispensable in keeping us informed during these troubled times of Western delusion and total control of the media landscape. It is important, I think, to see the seismic shifts in what appears before us as the end of not only US hegemony, but really it is the end of a period within the development of the Western capitalist model that is the end of the globalization and the post-Bretton Woods order. For the first time, it is the West, the first time in 1,000 years, it is the West, the collective West, that is being isolated from the world. It is not the world that is being isolated from the West as though it's in control of it. And this explains why the tariff wars that we've just seen unfold completely collapse. This is why we have seen for the first time at the behest of enormous developments in asymmetric warfare, that the ninth largest military force in the world can't even beat Hamas or Lebanon or Yemen or anybody. These are not only unprecedented times within our generational experience, or for that matter, the last 100 years. The closest thing that I can see that parallels this time on the micro level is a war that I personally experienced in 1956 with the Suez Canal crisis. From my balcony 3 meters off the ground in Suez, I saw and I witnessed the fall of the British Empire and the shifting of the baton to the new hegemon of the West in a bipolar world countering the USSR in the hands of Eisenhower. The same Israeli jets that bombed the canal in 1956 now bomb on a genocidal spree the Gaza Strip. But unlike the 1956 war, where the military and political objectives were quite clear and were meant to detooth a rising Arab nationalism, this is now the hands of a desperate, falling empire that has to resort to genocide itself. And the precursor to this, of course, is something, again, completely unprecedented, and that is the West's, the total collective West's humiliation in the war in Ukraine, where the entire NATO establishment gets its ass well and truly kicked by only one country. And this country, Russia, was described within all of the mainstream media as a gas station masquerading as a nation. It is Western hubris and delusion that accelerates this fall because the decisions that are made are counterproductive because the assumption is wrong. The West is no longer in control and it's collapsing. Its financial model does not create innovation. Monopoly capitalism, as it's been affectionately referred to, is over. It is being outperformed, it is being outcompeted by Chinese innovation and a completely new form of political economic systems that are going to be multipolar politically for sure, but whose models and the role of the state differ very radically from the ones we have been used to for the last 80 years. I quote Chairman Mao at the height of the threat of US invasion of China just after the Korean War. And he, and all of us thought it was a little wishful thinking at the time, he described the United States as a paper tiger. And he implored the world and his people to just dial it down and not to be afraid of America, because America will collapse under its own weight, that wasn't anything that had to be addressed or feared within any time frame that is viable. Fast forward 70 years, and we, through the Ukrainian war, see exactly that the West is a paper tiger. It cannot win a war to achieve a political objective if its life depends on it, and unfortunately, its life does depend on it. It's okay at fighting and dropping bombs on things that can't fight back. Same with the Israeli forces. It's all right as long as the little bastards cannot fight back. And underscoring the tactics that are only challenged by any peer competitors, which have now come up as China, Russia, and at the moment on the knife edge, Iran. And here I quote as the basis of the folly, Conrad in The Heart of Darkness. At the core of the Western paradigm, and why this text forms a seminal part of Western ideology, he has very, very clear and very well expressed anecdotes for the Western position culture. He bases the proposition that Kurds and Western civilization and the colonizers of Africa are superior because of their literacy. And like Joseph Borrell said just 3 years ago, that Europe was a garden surrounded by barbaric jungle. And he characterized all things that were not Western as dark shadows lurking, surrounding. And the only solution and the only viable reaction of the West was to, and I quote, exterminate the brutes. Gaza is for the first time an attempt to exterminate the brutes, get rid of everything Arabic. But the interesting thing about it is there's no apology for it. For the first time, genocide is something to be proud of because, as I quote the Israeli defense minister itself, there is no such thing as an innocent Palestinian. Babies, children, etc., all have to be wiped out. They are all enemies or potential enemies. This, of course, is complicit with all the other arms of the Western establishment. But let's look beyond that. Beyond that, we have a history of global genocide, wiping out one culture after another. The chief and most obvious ones of these are nation states like Israel, like Australia, like America, whose very foundation depended on genocide. You just have the notion of terra nullius. Now, all these things most people accept, and so what, you say? Yeah, okay, but it's a bit unfortunate. But we're not responsible for that. We've grown past this. We, after all, in the West, have sensibility. We feel sorry for the victims of past genocides. We feel sorry for the plight of the poor indigenous people, and we seek to address this through notions of multiculturalism or whatever. But it's inescapable, however, is when push comes to shove, if you push any progressive, any left-wing or right-wing person to the point and say, yes, okay, you want a more equal society. Yes, you don't want the oligarchs and the super rich to get away with murder. Yes, you would like, a democracy and a fairer system. But you push that to the idea whether there is anything that they would consider acceptable to total Western hegemony, and they will admit, no. If you push any progressive, any small L liberal, let alone a more extreme right-wing position on the defence of the West and social democratic liberal values, you will see a reluctance, let alone a violent opposition to the idea that there can't possibly be any alternative to a justification for the West doing everything in its power, including genocide, or how unfortunate it is, in order to maintain that hegemony, because there cannot be another idea that challenges this where the West, in its freedom and liberal values, can possibly share power or even accept any alternative power that isn't in its image. The idea just conjures up fascism or the false dichotomy that the American State Department sells throughout the world. It's autocracy. Or, what's worse, that anything else would enslave us and completely demolish the diversity and liberal order that allows tolerance of gay rights, of women's feminism, and a whole heap of other things, the defense of which justifies complete and utter Western domination in the political sphere throughout the globe. And if it means that means genocidally wiping out populations, well, it's worth it, because anything is worse than suffering the indignities of an alternative world, which to them is tantamount to a barbaric, autocratic subjugation at the hands of clitoristomizing terrorists and Muslim phobia at best. And Chinese yellow hordes circling Australia with the intention of a full-scale invasion to take our goodies and to disrupt our white supremacist little island. The following episodes will look at the overall history of how empires have handled their collapse, which is what is happening today, what it particularly means for the people living in the West, but much, much more importantly, what it means for the entire globe and the peoples that don't live in the West, who have finally got their act together after 1,000 years of trying in order to put a stop to the horrific exploitation and the consequent subjugation of all cultures that don't conform to the image of the West. Now, at no time do I want to imply that this is a uniform Western view in terms of the people that live in the West. Because I don't mean all the people in the West, although it applies to quite a lot of them. What I mean is the West as a national and ethnic and cultural and political entity. The West is the notion that we have had since the First Crusade that anything that is not European, that is not Eurocentric, that is not, it later invented the word white, because under the Roman Empire there was no such thing as white, and at its core, with the invention of what we now call modernity, the notion that our rational selves in a secular order is superior to anything that is not in our image. Now, it is indeed ironic that most of the concepts that the West uses to justify its hegemony and its superiority, in fact, had their roots in things that were not Western at all. It's bizarre. The idea of secularism, humanism, the idea of a people's dictated state, we have that in Islam 500-600 years before Thomas Hobbes. Most of the scientific revolutions are the basis of the Enlightenment itself, rationality, the idea of the steam engine, the technology. Most of those things were invented at least 500 years before algebra itself in the Islamic universities. Both Cambridge and Oxford, when they were formed in the medieval times, both had as their first departments the departments of Arabic. Because without Arabic and the translation of Arabic texts, Europe could not even have access to any of the classic texts. They had no access to the philosophers of ancient Greece. They had no access to any Arabic mathematicians, science, medicine. It was barbaric and it was illiterate. And even when you get to the Renaissance itself, it's no accident that the Renaissance itself could only have happened once the Ottomans succeeded in toppling the Roman Empire in Constantinople and through the exodus of its craftsmen and philosophers into the West that started schools training the West in the basics of how to conduct scholarship. Now, all these things, in a sense, can be expressed two ways. One, we can have a look at the overall picture, have a look at the bookends of 1,000 years, and then see all the things that are happening through that lens, or we could do it the other way around. You have a look at the completely unprecedented and shocking things that we are experiencing right now that are completely unfathomable, and I did not think I'd experience in my own lifetime, and then work backwards and say, what does it mean that the whole of NATO can't beat Russia in the first war in Europe? What does it mean that two aircraft fleets can't bomb the big blazers out of Yemen? It can't even keep the Suez Canal and the Red Sea operable. What does it mean that the entire armed to the hilt with 2,000-pound bombs that Israel cannot find, let alone defeat Hamas, which is all bowed under tunnels, which you would think would be an easy enough thing to address? Why there be blazes out of the 7 years that were scheduled, 7 countries, sorry, that were scheduled to be regime changed after 9/11, is Iran still not invaded, and there is a massive reluctance to do so. Why is it that the West ums and ahs, not knowing what to do in order to stop being humiliated at every turn and seeing its entire economic basis fall to bits through massive debt, through massive balance of payments problems, through a humiliating falling behind in innovations and at the very core of the capitalist monopolist paradigm that the West was always the thing to be copied. China, don't forget, was going to be the country that we did not have to worry about because, after all, the richer it got, the more it would want to be like us. And liberal democracy run by the most powerful monopolist capitalists whose money could control the government and buy off all sides of politics in a secular order that would not disturb its path to globalization. Well, globalization is collapsing. I'm based in Australia, and of course, I grew up here as a refugee from the Suez Canal crisis. I've already seen the toppling of one empire. I've seen the baton shift to the rise of another. I am very well aware of the use-by dates of empires, having myself witnessed the fall of. I didn't know English when I came here, and at that time, I could be forgiven to say that we all aspired and identified with becoming Western. It seemed as though the Western ticket was the only ticket to industrialization, to wealth, to decent social services. And if you weren't Western, you're going to get the shit kicked out of you anyway. We weren't happy. We lived on a quiet street. We had a quarter-acre block. There were no bombs. There were no bombs. Kids just went to school. I fell in love with meat pies and tomato sauce. I love Roy Rogers and Superman. Everything was good. But there was an unease, There was an unease that my cousins and everyone that was left behind in the Sinai deserts in Egypt and the Gaza Strip, they were still bearing the brunt of sanctions and being treated like shit. But so be it. My parents had all of the hopes that we would live the Western white dream, and maybe even go to university, maybe even become professionals and living the dream. Then there was Elvis Presley, then the Beatles, and all that came completely collapsing. Not that I realised it at the time, but in the same way that the Suez Canal crisis opened my eyes at the age of 6 to the fact that things changed and your position in them was dangerous and risked life and limb for things that you had to come to understand. And that was geopolitics. That was a whole bunch of things that I didn't want to know. But in 1966, Australia started conscripting us. And the idea that I would be given a gun to go to a place I never heard of called, I couldn't even pronounce it, didn't even know what it was, called Vietnam, to start killing people that I'd never heard of. And for what? It's a long way away because America thought it was a good idea to go and kill them, to control them, and somehow I had to go and shoot these people. And I just thought to myself, you and what army, you can get fucked. Not on. And we were put in a quandary. How can this land that offers us freedom, safety, and democracy possibly do things that were more akin to Nazi Germany? What do you mean I'm supposed to kill people? And the idea was that, look, if you don't do that, then you're not going to protect the freedoms that you have. So don't be an ungrateful little bastard. And so it was that I had to put down my cream bun. I had to take off my school uniform. At the age of 16, I was in year 10 at the time. And I hit the ground running and started joining the protest movement, of which there was only 20 of us and some really ugly, hairy armpitted unionists that I had nothing to do with. And I was introduced to things like the labour movement, left and right, Labour and Liberal, all things that I had absolutely no idea of. But the first thing that I realised was that Australia's been through this before. And that in 1916, there was a referendum about conscription. And guess what? The Australian people, my mates, voted against it. It was a referendum. And my first question, where was the referendum this time round? What the hell's going down? This is illegitimate. This is not about the Australian people at all. Somehow the government has just taken it upon itself to do something which is American cocksucking. Not on. We are not going to have another Gallipoli under foreign domination and officers. No. And this brandy little walk down the road thought, no, I think I'm getting this. It's the Suez Canal all over again. And it's all about hegemony and power. And the very things that got me to leave my home are just happening again. As things transpired, I wasn't alone. Not by a long shot. And it didn't take long before there were 2 million people in the moratoriums in Sydney. It also coincided with my discovering people like Bob Dylan, with learning about all these great philosophers, Freud, Marx, like Max Weber. My head, and don't forget I could hardly spell. But in the end, it wasn't it wasn't really difficult once you hit the ground running in politics to get rather good at it. For a start, you have to learn just to stay alive. Now, why do I bore you with this self-indulgent explanation? And it's this. It is really important for us to look past all the ideological crap about Israel has a right to defend itself. Russia unilaterally unprovoked attack on Ukraine, of our national interests, that America is our security partner, bad China is just our money box. Because if we don't get a hold of ourselves as people in the West and identify with all our brothers in the global South as they structure a multipolar order to take on the hegemons of the West, we are going to just get written off like you would not believe. And we will revisit the same mistakes of the Depression, the same mistakes of Ukraine, because we're going to be the pointed end of what America uses in its coming stoush with China. The other reason is that as the shift happens, and it won't be all that gradual, it'll be fairly rapid, from the distractions and the delays caused by the Ukrainian conflict, which was completely underestimated by the West, and the complexities of the Middle East countries, which again, completely underestimated. How long could it possibly take to march into Beirut again? Done it before. How long could it possibly take? They said 6 weeks to get rid of Hamas. And how long could it possibly take to depopulate Gaza? Especially when you go through these hospitals, you're starving to death with the blockades. This isn't rocket science. But it hasn't worked out like that at all. What we're now facing is a completely deluded hubris in the ideology of the West. And this is just as bad in the intelligentsia and the so-called progressives and the new left and the small L liberals, gay rights and all the rest of it. There is a complete misunderstanding that the West is now isolated and we're going down. And while we do go down for the first time, we recognize that our chief enemy and the thing that accelerates our fall, just as it was with Europe 2 years ago, is the United States itself. Our greatest security partner is, at the moment, by far our biggest threat. So the idea that we would spend $315 billion on nuclear-powered submarines whose only function is to be integrated into the United States military complex as it fights China, is suicidal. And for the first time, I can tell the world, and this is one of the functions of this channel, it is to represent the Pacific view of what is already expressed in a plethora of channels throughout the world. It is to express what is going on in the Pacific and what the tectonic shifts are in both opinion, popular opinion, and the changes of policy that are now brought about by the contradictions of the actions of the United States itself. The last month, for instance, has seen the two major parties, for the first time in my life, having to temper their support of the United States. For the first time, I've seen we have to find alternative markets. And yes, we won't be bullied by America. And we have to somehow work out some alternative strategic and defense agreements within Asia. On this channel, we will be interviewing the main voices, which are very few and far between with access to mainstream media exposure, people like Paul Keating, Hugh White, the respected academics who have always maintained, as I have in my radio programs for many years, that Australia, and this is a very seminal quote, Australia has to find its security within Asia, not from Asia. We are no longer to see ourselves as white supremacist, genocidal, Western liberal apparatchiks that are going to go down with the American ship. We have to negotiate and transition from that image of ourselves to a nation of us as being a part of Asia. And that will involve two things. Otherwise, we become the Israel of an apartheid Israeli state within Asia, the white tribe of American liberty. If you don't want to get wiped out by America itself, then we have to go through the painful process of the state and all the parties starting to reflect the realities of the composition of our population, which is one of the most diverse in the whole world. And furthermore, start to distance ourselves from the absolute subjugation we have had throughout the whole period of white settlement in Australia, of being blind, obedient apparatchiks of white supremacy, firstly with the British Empire, and then in 1941, when times were bad, switching that allegiance to America. Let me quote Henry Kissinger in the 1970s. To be an enemy of America, of the United States, is very dangerous. We can bomb the shit out of you, regime change, humiliate you, sanction you out of existence. But, he said, and this is the killer, to be an ally of the United States is fatal. Just get your head around that for a second. To be an ally of the United States is not just dangerous. You can rebuild. You've seen one war after another, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, they rebuild, they come back and wipe the shit out of American forces through asymmetric warfare, insurgents. The political game has not been to be an ally is irreversible. You are going down. Now, you say to yourself, well, hold on, you can't imagine the alliance of Western countries to be a sucker for this. And yes, that's exactly what is happening. That's exactly what is happening. But before we go on to the Western alliances, think of all of America's allies that they armed to the hilt to do their dirty jobs. Saddam Hussein was armed for 10 years in attacking Iran at US's request. Mubarak in Egypt. It just goes on. Dien Bien Phu, the president of South Vietnam, who in the end they dispatched very, very quickly. The Vietnamese forces, the Iraqi whole government, the Kurds in their uprising. The list is endless. In the end, America wipes you off the face of the earth. When it comes to the European and Western white alliance, the Eurocentric forces, the forces of liberalism, the neoliberal wet dream, until last year, could you have imagined that America actually attacks their economic viability and considers them their enemy? For what reason? It's not even because it has a trade surplus. Australia, for instance, has a trade deficit with the United States, and yet it's still subject to tariffs that undermine the few exports we do make. And this at a time when one Prime Minister, from Malcolm Turnbull to Albanese now, makes the strongest appeal to our American masters that why are you kicking our ass? Because don't forget, America owns a majority interest in every single sector of the Australian economy. The whole banking system is owned by American corporations. The whole mineral sector is owned by American corporations. The whole financial system, everything is owned by America except people's houses. And that's about it, which is a non-productive asset. We are a vassal economic state. And that's one of the reasons why it's going to be difficult to bring ourselves off this. But despite this, America wants to annex Canada to be the 51st state, wants to take over Greenland from its ally, Denmark. It has put in punishing levels of tariffs throughout Europe, throughout Japan, and for the first time in my lifetime, I've seen a kickback from within the other. Our podcast will follow these up, and we'll follow them very, very closely. And we'll do it from a Pacific perspective. This will be the channel that you go to for a focus on China, focus on Pacific, and a focus on the integration of the Western lands as it applies to the parts of the world that will become a huge focus once their road bumps manage to settle down a bit, i.e. NATO-driven expansionist Europe, that'll die down. The Middle East will eventually die down. Much to American embarrassment, there'll be fractured alliances, then the focus will be on the Chinese role. When that happens, it is to this channel that you'll go to for more in-depth analysis of acknowledging the history of how we got there and the contradictions of Australia's role in it, but also generally the complex arrangements that exist within the South Pacific and the immense disruptive effects of a rising ASEAN economic and cultural and political bloc of the ASEAN countries of Southeast Asia, as well as focusing on the individual examples of that, like the rise of Indonesia, which is scheduled to be the fifth largest economy within 10 years. We have a complete, unrecognizable map of the globe that we are watching the transition to, which is dubbed the multipolar world, better word, that really focuses on the rise of multilateral organizations like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, BRICS, and the rise of Eurasia, which have been antithetical for over 120 years through the eyes of the geographical pivot of empire starting in 1904 in the hands of Alfred Mackinder. All of these will be notated in episodes as we go along. The Foreign Secretary, who reasoned that the only way that naval-based colonial hegemonic enterprises of the West can only, in the end, be challenged by any rival land-based power, and for that, Eurasia was its only threat. So what all colonial Western powers had in common was a commitment to create what was called a crescent of resistance, a ring of chaos that would entangle what we now call the Middle East, but is now called West Asia from a Chinese perspective. In other words, the Arabia, Middle East had to be perpetually unstable in order for Eurasia to ever unite. And guess what? That's exactly what is happening. That's exactly what has happened. And pivotal to that, of course, is the Primakov doctrine, who was the foreign minister of Russia under Yeltsin, who posited that the only way that the Eurasian landmass could possibly be unified and pose some viable threat to Western hegemony was in the triumvirate of Russia, China, and India. That, of course, has changed since the Ukrainian war, where India, which was seen as a bit of a pussy, is now being replaced by Iran. So the triumvirate of the new multipolar essence and the flag wavers of the BRICS is now firmly in the hands of Iran. To wrap up, this will be a series of podcasts which will go in depth with a lot more academic rigour and also a lot more evidence to posit the paradigms that are developing as we speak. This is not about guessworking the future. This is about seeing the evidence right before our eyes, which are completely covered and obfuscated by mainstream media, because we're living in the worst information bubble I've ever seen in my life. I turn on the ABC, for instance, which is the state government, which is the federal government owned public station, which, by the way, has a rating of less than 500,000. Apart from Gen Z, all of the people of European background in most of the West are still turning on mainstream media. Gen Z is not. People from other cultures do not. They have their own media, digital media, and that's a part of the network that we are joining. They don't buy the narrative. That narrative, and you can always tell that, it's a bit of a shock because the terminology is always the same. The phrases are always the same. It's just too much of a con job. In fact, there is a thing called the Centre of Strategic Studies, which actually coordinates through being funded by the American State Department to make sure that the media reads from a script. So no use turning on the CNN or Sky News or Murdoch Press, or the language is always the same. And if you ask journalists, they say, "I don't know, I'm not censored. I can say whatever I like." The point is this: if you don't believe in the narrative, you're not going to have that job. Simple as that. It is irrelevant whether you're allowed to say what you think, as long as you agree with this false narrative that is deluded, dangerous, and leading us not only nowhere to a very dangerous place. The rise of China, at its core, frightens the big Jesus out of America, not because it's just winning on trade. Don't forget it has a surplus now of something like $30 billion a month, which, by the way, is about to go out the window. But it doesn't worry China at all. China has already expanded BRICS to a point where it represents 55% of the world's population, something like nearly 40% of the world's economy. It doesn't need America. America only accounts for 12% of its exports. It is not worried about sanctions. It is not worried about cutting off America. America seems to be assuming that if it just bullies Australia and Canada and China, of course they have to come kissing Trump's ass, in his own words. They're all ringing me up to kiss my ass. Sorry, they don't need you. They've got alternative markets and they've got better products and they've just outcompeted you. You're just shooting yourself in the foot. And Australia is in the worst of all positions of any of the Western allies. Because unlike all the other Western allies, every single one of our industries is owned by the United States hedge funds and corporations. And the one time that a federal government, had the audacity to wanting to fund and build its own resource development, which was a gas pipeline from the fields of Western Australia to service the eastern seaboard, it was regime changed and the government was sacked, through causing a a parliamentary crisis, all at the behest and design of the CIA, as is written up by a CIA operative that was a whistleblower in a book that he wrote called The Falcon and the Snowman in the 1970s. So the sacking of the Whitlam government was always seen as an internal matter. It was not. And at its basis, it had two issues. One was this crazy idea that this colonial outpost would dare to want to own one single skerrig of its own resources, out of the question. And number two, it was starting to demand equal access, as some say in the supposedly joint operation of the Pine Gap, which is one of the 5A's basic surveillance and intelligence satellite coordination system that coordinates all weapon delivery systems and satellites. And now here we are. We have an Asia that is growing in leaps and bounds. We have Australia, which is one of the wealthiest resource superpowers in the world, having to cope with the owners of its industries now having a go at it. What's a white boy supposed to do? But we've done everything right. We've killed all the blacks. We've sucked American dick. We've fought every single war that you want us to. We've put our blood on the line, and you treat us like shit. What the fuck's going down? And in this channel, we will go them one by one in trying to get our head around why it is that we, who should be the highest per capita country in the world, are about to face a situation of fiscal complete rectitude. We're being fucked. Where's the money and where's the tax base going to come from to fund what is arguably the world's best health system, the world's best education system? There is nothing we can't do. And don't forget, Australia's not like England. It's not like Europe. And it's not because of the white imperialist cocksuckers that we're different. It's because of the solid Fenians and rebellion underbelly that the Irish brought to this country. It's not the black resistance even, and it's not the Wogs who had a communist background. All that's bullshit. It was the Irish that made sure that they were not going to set up a country where they got flogged to death and transported for a sack of potatoes. No way. And that's what gives us the whole mythology, which bored a kid like me coming from the other part of the world. It's mateship, looking after each other. They don't give a fuck about class warfare, and empire means nothing to us. Although in the past, well, it was mainly English, there was a massive schism and a minority that went, jingo, we want to be British. And there we have it. We now have a situation where 1/3 of our population no longer puts number one for either of the two main political parties, which, by the way, is becoming like that in America also. We've seen the collapse of the two-party system in many of the countries of Europe. We have independence. We have minority governments. They've lost control, just like Israel's lost control. The Israel lobby just can't get away with murder the way it used to. We are winning. Yes, we've got a long way to go. They still have the best guns and they can commit genocide, but we are winning. They just can't even get rid of Hamas. They can't blast the blazes out of Yemen with 2 aircraft carrier groups and 20 full-blown American bases around the poorest country in the world. Brothers and sisters, it's ugly, it's hard, but we're winning.